In the marble corridors of imperial Rome, power was never more fragile than in the hours after an emperor's death. When the most powerful man in the known world stopped breathing, a dangerous vacuum opened, and in that vacuum the very men sworn to protect the throne became its greatest threat. The Praetorian Guard stands as one of history's most paradoxical institutions. Established by Augustus around 27 BCE as an elite protective force for the emperor, they evolved into something far more sinister. By the 3rd century CE, they had become kingmakers and king-killers, assassinating at least a dozen emperors and auctioning the imperial throne to the highest bidder. But the Guard's power extended beyond political violence. During what Romans called the interregnum, the period between one emperor's death and his successor's secure assumption of power, these soldiers exercised nearly absolute authority over Rome. No other military force was permitted within the city's sacred boundary. The Senate possessed no armed enforcement. For those critical hours or days, the Praetorian Guard controlled everything within Rome's walls, including the imperial palace and everyone inside it. This created a situation that Roman historians rarely discuss directly. The sources that survive focus meticulously on political transitions, documenting which senators gained influence, which rivals were executed, and how property was redistributed. Male relatives of dead emperors are tracked with precision, exiled to distant islands, forced into suicide, or occasionally permitted to live in obscurity. But imperial women simply disappear from the record. An empress who commanded thousands of household slaves and received foreign ambassadors would be mentioned as having retired to private life, with no details about what that transition involved. The women of the imperial household, wives, daughters, sisters, vanish from history during these crucial hours, their experiences left as silence. Modern historians have long noted this absence. What actually happened to these women during the dangerous interregnum? The answer lies in fragmentary evidence scattered across centuries of sources, in cryptic references that contemporary readers would have understood, and in the structural realities of Roman military culture. The Praetorian Guard was not a ceremonial force. These were hardened soldiers drawn from Rome's legions, stationed in the capital while their comrades fought on distant frontiers. They received substantially higher pay than regular troops and enjoyed privileges that generated resentment among ordinary citizens, but they also lived under strict discipline, with limited access to the wealth and luxury that surrounded them daily within the palace. The evidence suggests that during the interregnum, certain unstated permissions came into effect. The incoming emperor would provide a substantial donative, essentially a bribe, to secure the Guard's loyalty. The prefect's position would be confirmed or negotiated, and the palace itself, with everything in it, was understood to be temporarily at the Guard's disposal. Everything in it included people. Imperial household members were suddenly without protection, no longer under the authority of a dead emperor but not yet under the protection of his successor. Their elevated status, which had been their shield, became a target for soldiers who resented the aristocrats they served. We see hints of this in the sources. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, makes oblique references to traditional privileges during succession crises. Storia Augusta, though unreliable in many details, contains scattered mentions of imperial women suffering indignities during interregnum periods. Herodian describes palace household members being subject to the soldiers' pleasure after an emperor's fall. These phrases meant something specific to contemporary readers. Roman authors had conventions for discussing sexual violence without explicit description, especially regarding high-status women. When they wrote that someone was dishonored or subjected to insult, their audience understood. The structural evidence supports this interpretation. Roman military culture, like many ancient warrior cultures, included practices modern observers find disturbing. The rape of conquered populations was considered a normal privilege of victory. Soldiers expected access to the bodies of defeated enemies as part of their compensation. During the interregnum, imperial women occupied a legal and social position similar to conquered enemies. They belonged to a defeated regime. The men who had killed their protector now controlled their fate. No legal authority existed to restrain the Guard until the new emperor arrived and established his power. This created a window of terror that might last hours or days, depending on how quickly the succession could be secured. The longer the interregnum, the more complete the Guard's control, and the more vulnerable everyone in the palace became. What follows is a reconstruction based on the available evidence, the documented patterns of Praetorian behavior during succession crises, and the scattered references that historians have long recognized but rarely discussed in detail. While we cannot know the specific experiences of individual women, we can understand the system that made their suffering inevitable. The mechanics of an imperial assassination created predictable patterns. The Praetorian Guard would move first to secure the palace, preventing anyone from leaving and controlling information about what had occurred. Messengers would be dispatched to the incoming emperor, who was often waiting with military forces at a calculated distance from Rome. Then came the dangerous period of waiting. The historical record provides specific examples. When Emperor Pertinax was murdered by the Praetorian Guard in 193 CE, his wife and household were confined to the palace for nearly 3 days while the Guard auctioned the throne. Cassius Dio, a contemporary senator, writes that the household members suffered such treatment as might be expected from soldiers in control of a palace without restraint. His audience would have understood what he left unspecified after Emperor Elagabalus was killed in 222 CE. Sources describe his female relatives being subjected to the soldiers' revenge before the new emperor, Severus Alexander, could establish control. The specific acts are not detailed, but the context is clear. These women were being punished for their association with a hated regime. The pattern repeats across multiple succession crises. The guard secures the palace. The household is confined. The women particularly are described as suffering indignities, dishonor, or being subject to the soldier's will during the hours or days before legitimate authority is restored. Scholarly interpretation of these patterns has evolved. Earlier historians, often writing in the 19th and early 20th centuries, either ignored these references entirely or interpreted them as metaphorical, suggesting the women merely suffered fear or loss of dignity rather than physical assault. Modern scholarship has become more direct in acknowledging what the sources actually indicate. Professor Sandra Joshel's work on Roman slavery and sexual violence has examined how Roman authors encoded references to rape through euphemism. Professor Amy Rishlin has analyzed the conventions Roman historians used to discuss sexual assault against high-status women. Their research demonstrates that phrases like subjected to insult or suffered what might be expected carried specific meanings that contemporary readers immediately recognized. The legal evidence also illuminates these practices. Roman law provided no category for prosecuting crimes committed against imperial women during an interregnum. They were not citizens with legal protections. Their status derived entirely from their relationship to the emperor, and he was dead. The incoming emperor could choose to punish such acts, but he often declined to do so, understanding that alienating the guard threatened his own position. The silence in the historical record becomes evidence itself. When Roman historians, who documented other forms of violence in explicit detail, consistently avoid specifics regarding imperial women during succession crises, their silence indicates not absence but discretion about matters considered shameful or dangerous to discuss directly. This was not merely criminal behavior by individual soldiers, it was structural violence enabled by the political system. The Praetorian Guard had become so powerful that emperors could not rule without their support. That support had to be purchased with payments, privileges, and implicit permissions that included access to the defeated household. The incoming emperor faced a calculation. He could punish the guard for their treatment of the previous imperial family, risking the very support he needed to secure his throne. Or he could ignore what had occurred, treating it as an unfortunate but unavoidable aspect of the transition. Overwhelmingly, emperors chose the second option. The women who survived these interregnums rarely spoke of their experiences. Those who appeared in later sources had retired to private life or entered religious seclusion. Some received financial settlements, essentially compensation purchased through silence. Others disappeared from history entirely, their fates unknown. The Praetorian Guard's power continued until 312 CE, when Emperor Constantine disbanded them entirely after defeating his rival Maxentius. Constantine understood what generations of earlier emperors had learned. The Guard had become an institution that corrupted every succession and made stable governance impossible. What happened during Rome's interregnums revealed something fundamental about power in ancient societies. Sexual violence against women of defeated regimes was not exceptional behavior by criminal individuals but systematic practice embedded in military culture and enabled by political structures. The women of Rome's imperial households lived with this knowledge. Every empress understood that her position was absolutely secure only as long as her husband lived. Every daughter of the imperial family knew that a political crisis could transform her from untouchable aristocrat to vulnerable captive within hours. This was Rome's darkest secret, not the violence itself, which was common enough in ancient warfare, but the systematic way that violence was built into the structures of imperial succession. The men sworn to protect the emperor's family became, in the moment of his death, their greatest threat.